Good morning. This is the Bias Buzz special edition. Today I'm joined by my very special guest and friend, John Gizzi, the national political columnist, I guess, for Newsmax and the White House correspondent for Newsmax. Welcome, John. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Don. It's a special pleasure to be here. I recall many such sessions with your late father, Reed Irvine, and in fact once introducing him to my Kiwanis Club in Georgetown as the Sergeant Joe Friday of modern media. And if he was Sergeant Joe Friday, I guess that makes you the James Bond.
Well, I'll take that. All right. Well, what I want to let's start. Actually, this morning, let's start with your breakfast with Bernie Sanders. That's great that you got to go see him and everything like that. What happened? What was this all about?
Well, for one thing, Senator Sanders, who appears very much as triumphal a figure in the Democratic Party as Ronald Reagan was in the Republican Party when he narrowly lost the nomination in 1976, was in fine form. He made a strong plea that the Democratic Party has to get away from its corporate backers, its establishment ties, and support the working man and woman. And what that means is a strong statement against discrimination, a living wage for people who work 40 hours a week, infrastructure, and truly fair trade. He was opposed to the TPP trade agreement and believe it's dead. He agrees with President-elect Trump that NAFTA needs to be rewired. But most of all, he made it very clear this morning that he is going to be an important figure in the Democratic Party as it goes into the role of loyal opposition. And we haven't heard the last of Bernie Sanders.
Right, and Senator Schumer, who's going to be the minority leader, has given him a role for outreach, I guess it is.
Right, he's the outreach chairman. He says, I've been 1 day on the job in leadership. I might add that the breakfast was courtesy of the Christian Science Monitor, and every seat in the place was filled. 40 people were there. Senator Schumer, with whom Bernie Sanders has a good relationship, now includes him in leadership. And his idea is that he wants to reach out to the people who supported him for president, who worked in his campaign, share his views on fairness and a fair shake, and try to bring them in the Democratic Party. It was no surprise that 1/3 of Americans who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 voted for Donald Trump now. And he believes this calls for a new message in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, so this will be a very interesting time going forward. Now, I want to mine that great political mind of yours, and just give me an overview of what you thought about the election. What happened here?
Well, inarguably, it is the biggest political upset in presidential politics. I used to say it was the biggest since Harry Truman's win in 1948. But as a lot of people, notably my wife, point out, they did not have the sophisticated polling, the 24-hour tracking that we do. While a few brave souls said that Trump would win, Nate Silver and the CNN poll and New York Times, ABC, all gave it to Hillary Clinton, albeit by a close margin. I think there were more people stunned by saying President-elect Trump Wednesday morning than would have been if they were saying President-elect Clinton. As to how it happened, Bernie Sanders may have said it best. People were angry with the status quo. That's Latin for the mess we're in. They were uncertain about the future, and we see polls, particularly among young people, who don't think that there are better times coming, and parents who say that life will be more difficult for their children than it was for them. That's a first, by the way, in history. I also think a lot of other things, the foreign involvement and Trump's strong suggestion that he would pull back from internationalism was appealing to that. But finally, I think first and foremost, here was a businessman, the first president who's neither held elective office nor appointive office of any kind in government, who said exactly what was on his mind, either in debates, speeches, or on Twitter to his 30 million followers. Donald Trump, I've said, is to Twitter what Franklin D. Roosevelt was to radio. And there were an entirely new set of rules out there. In effect, Donald Trump sensed the electorate. He burned the old rule book, and he won.
Okay, so what do you think of the effect of having, Kellyanne Conway, Dave Bossie, Steve Bannon? Was that kind of the thing that helped push him over the top in the sense of giving the campaign a little more direction and keeping Donald Trump on track?
No, he would say that, because if you notice at the end, when he was tempted to say what he was really thinking, he'd say, "Hold on, Donald, stay on message, Donald." And I think the individuals you mentioned had a role in that because they have his confidence. What I find interesting is he is bringing them in his transition. We'll bring at least one into his White House. But at the same time, he is working with some mainstays of government. Vice President-elect Mike Pence, someone I've known for 28 years, will have a very big role, almost that of a prime minister in government. Reince Priebus, Republican National Chairman, becomes the White House Chief of Staff. I might add only the second White House Chief of Staff since the position was created who has never had state or national government experience of any kind.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, let me ask you about, you mentioned how the polls, we didn't have polls back in the Truman years, and
not accurate polls.
Not accurate polls.
The Gallup poll existed, and the Roper poll was put out of business, I think, by Truman's win.
Yeah, but you have all kinds of polling methods and things that are going on here. How did they miss? Did they just totally miss those that I know people personally who said that they were going to vote for Trump, but those are probably people who weren't probably willing to say it too much in a public setting. It seemed to be there's a lot of undercurrent of people who were going to vote for Trump but weren't necessarily going to tell friends or relatives they were going to do, so maybe they didn't tell the pollsters that.
There's some of that, and we've seen it in a very big way in the United Kingdom in the vote for Brexit. It became socially uncomfortable to say you were going to vote to leave the European Union. I've written about it in the case of the Alternate for Germany Party, AfD, which continually punches above its weight in the provincial elections in Germany on a hardline anti-immigration platform and criticizing Chancellor Merkel for her welcoming so many refugees into Germany. We saw the same thing with Donald Trump. At the same time, it would appear that the pool of blue-collar voters, Americans without a college education, evangelical Christians, and Roman Catholics, was underrated. The turnout among all of those groups was far more significant than the ratio of Trump support to Clinton support. They punched above their weight. And we saw this with minorities and with unmarried women in the case of Barack Obama's reelection. We saw it with white, lower, and middle-income Americans today.
Do you compare any of the people who crossed over, like the blue-collar type people, do you compare them to the Reagan Democrats?
To a great degree, but let's put it on the table. Many of the Reagan Democrats have become Republicans already. They were brought over by Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton did a lot to bring them back. In 1992, 4 million people who had voted for Bush the previous time and for Reagan twice were disappointed by Bush, raising their taxes, increasing regulation, and cutting defense spending, and they voted for Governor Clinton, who was a very acceptable alternative at the time. So many of them have become Republicans. The next generation has been born and is voting already, but they're still around, just not in the numbers they were.
Okay, so now let's talk about this transition. You mentioned Reince Priebus. I mean, Steve Bannon has become a very hot topic, a controversial figure.
Bernie Sanders called for the president-elect to withdraw his appointment today.
Which I don't think is going to happen.
No.
By any stretch of the imagination. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that that Trump really cares what people think about his appointments necessarily. I mean, he knew going in that Bannon was going to be a controversial pick, but he also, I think, wants to rely on his advice and all the knowledge that he had.
I note with interest that he is in the position that Franklin Roosevelt had Louis Howe, a former journalist himself, in the White House, that he doesn't administer anything per se. He's not a chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff. He is a senior advisor, and he is just there for the president to bounce ideas off, to talk to, and be his alter ego, so to speak.
Yeah, he's not crafting legislation per se and things like that, right?
No.
So okay. Now, what about the cabinet? There's a lot of names being floated about for all these cabinet positions. What are you betting on here as things are starting to shake out?
Well, I'm betting and I'm re-betting the next day because this changes so much. And let me give you a good example. It seemed a foregone conclusion that former Mayor Rudy Giuliani would become Attorney General. He's a natural for the position as a former federal prosecutor, former official of the Justice Department. But sources now indicate that he did not want to go through what would surely be a devastating and exhausting confirmation hearing at the hands of Chuck Schumer, Senate Democratic leader. More than likely, because he's close to the president-elect, he'll be named Secretary of State if he wants it. He may well want to be a gray eminence the way Vernon Jordan, the Washington super lawyer, was to Bill Clinton, and perhaps give advice to the president over the golf course.
Really, with Rudy, Secretary of State. I mean, what's the play there? I mean, what is his experience in that position?
The idea is that so many people who had experience in these positions brought us to the situation we're at. And if you brought true outsiders in, you might get a different perspective. William F. Buckley used to say he would prefer to be governed by the first 25 names in the Manhattan telephone directory rather than the political elites of the time.
Right.
Now, that said, I will make a case for you that Rudy Giuliani is an internationally known figure, knighted by the Queen, sought for advice on security from terrorism around the world. People know who he is. If he were to go to Senegal in Africa, if he were to go to Djibouti on the other side of the continent, go to Bahrain, or any of these places, they would know who he was.
Okay. What about some other positions? I mean, Ben Carson apparently has turned down a position in administration, citing what I saw in the news report said that didn't have enough experience. Where are we going with some of these other things like HHS or Defense Secretary? I guess those types of things. Do you have anything out there?
The person who would know the most about HHS, housing and urban development, and domestic policy in general is Ken Blackwell, former state treasurer of Ohio, formerly with the Family Research Council, an early backer of Donald Trump, a black man who, as he puts it, is a conservative who happens to be black. And Ken, I am sure, will wind up as either the White House Assistant for Domestic Affairs or handling one of the key domestic portfolios in the president's cabinet. And he is a solid pro-family conservative, was Secretary of State of Ohio, ran for governor of Ohio, is a past mayor of Cincinnati. He will be an interesting and informative find for the new president.
Do you think that President-elect Trump is going to use diversity as a part of his thinking in terms of this, that he will try to make sure he has blacks, women, that
Yes.
kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's important to him because the criticism that a cabinet does not look like America, there's a saying, it's needless aggravation. It's something he does not need, particularly given the circumstances of his election, and when people like Bernie Sanders charge that he is racist and made homophobic, misogynist appeals. Now, I would say it wouldn't surprise me if he were to put, say, Kelly Ayotte, narrowly defeated senator from New Hampshire, in at the United Nations, or he would have Ronna Romney McDaniel, Republican state chairman of Michigan, a key state, the niece of Mitt Romney, in as Republican national chairman. She delivered for him. I can think of a number of other women who would be very important. Jan Brewer, the former governor of Arizona, perhaps as Interior Secretary.
Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about Jan. That's yeah, that might work for that. What about the family in terms of the kids? I mean, do you expect the kids to have any kind of advisory role, officially, unofficially?
The president-elect has a close family and relies a lot on his children. I would say he would continue to call on them and ask for advice about things, but it is always very uncomfortable when someone gives a family member a role in administration. When he was reelected in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt appointed his son James to be his executive assistant. And James Roosevelt was just in over his head. He got an ulcer after 1 year and quit. And this is after the press continually mocked him as the crown prince. So it's very difficult. In the case of Robert Kennedy working for his brother John, that's someone I would have supported in that position, and the American Civil Liberties Union was driven to distraction by him. Today he would be a major target of all of the civil liberties groups for the way he operated, but he had his brother's confidence and did some good things, did some bad things, such as going after union leaders and the steel companies. But the point was the Attorney General and the President obviously had a good working relationship. I don't see Donald Trump doing that.
All right, you've been a member of the working press for quite a number of years now.
Quite a number.
What do you think? You know, we're seeing a lot of reports about how the media, what their coverage was of Trump during the campaign. There was the New York Times has come out. Salzberg, the publisher, came out and said that they promised to cover his administration fairly. Leslie Stahl said after the 60 Minutes interview last week that there's no doubt that Trump has a deep animosity for the press. Is the press, and the president-elect, are they going to get along? What's the coverage? What kind of coverage you expect coming out of this?
I think the president-elect and the press are going to get along fine, at least for what we call the honeymoon period. President Obama, when he came in, was having one press conference.
Whoops.
That once happened at the White House, and I got my phone taken away from me. I don't think Don's going to repeat that.
No, I won't do that.
But what I recall, speaking of the White House, is that President Obama was giving monthly news conferences and having them in prime time. And people saw a golden age of rapport with the president. He was giving interviews in the Oval Office with reporters. Now today, my colleagues such as Ann Compton, our past president of the White House Correspondents Association, Steve Holland of Reuters, another past president, are all unanimous in agreeing that this administration has been the most closed door in terms of providing information for the press. Like previous presidents, he sporadically gives news conferences and announces them at the last minute. They're usually held in the morning or afternoon at the White House. And there's one occasion where he went a long period without talking to then Speaker of the House, John Boehner. And then they did have a meeting in the White House, and guess what? Reporters learned about it when the White House released a picture of them long after Mr. Boehner had gone back to work.
Well, what do you think about this latest brouhaha was just that Trump kind of stuck around and went out to dinner, and somebody took a picture there, and then the press found out about it, and they seemed to have their nose out of joint that they were not allowed to do this. Now, I saw an article, a piece in Politico, that Mike McCurry said that he thinks that going forward, maybe the rules should be changed anyway with the way the press has been handled in the past. Not that he wants to say ditching the White House press corps, but Trump is such a different kind of a person that maybe the way it's been done traditionally, maybe it's not a bad idea to rethink, does the press need to be everywhere to follow him, to every single event type of a thing like that?
It's going to be hard after so many years of the press doing it. And remember something, the president's movements have been carefully choreographed and guarded since November 22nd, 1963. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a president to simply sneak out of the White House and walk among the people. It is said that Pope John Paul II did that in Rome, that he would just go out and he would talk to regular people, but in the process he exasperated the Swiss guards who were out there to protect him. A president, it would be far more difficult, and I think the reaction would be far worse from his security detail.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, too, though, because, up until the time he ran for president, until the time he became the nominee, and I guess he got Secret Service protection at that point, I mean, Trump, to a certain extent, is used to just kind of going where he wants to go and meeting people and dealing with business leaders. Things are going to be different for him now.
And they certainly are, as they are for all presidents. One could say that Ronald Reagan, for example, as governor of the nation's largest state, knew a little bit about this, that President Nixon, who was vice president, or George H.W. Bush, also understudied to a president, understood these things. He's going to be a little bit different kind of a case because, as I said, he's never held elective or appointive office before. But I have a funny feeling he will adapt to it. All presidents do.
Okay, now let me ask you about the Electoral College, because that has become a big subject of discussion among the liberals. Senator Boxer's introducing a piece of legislation. She wants to abolish it, change it, which is not going to go anywhere because you need 38 states to ratify it, and I don't see the small states going anywhere near that. But you have all these protests, which I feel a lot of these people, they don't even know what they're protesting. A lot of them didn't vote. The ones
No.
It's kind of crazy. I mean, what do you think about all of this this discussion?
Well, you know something? I have heard this debate and this argument for nearly half a century about getting rid of the Electoral College. If you go back to the 2000 election that was disputed between Al Gore and George W. Bush, Democrats called the Republican who was declared the winner his fraudulency. There were bumper stickers out, "Re-elect Gore," and I think it limited the new president in his agenda quite a bit because of the uncertainty of his win. And who introduced the first bill, as her first bill, one to abolish the Electoral College and go to popular election of a president? Senator Hillary Clinton of New York.
Oh, really?
In 2001. It went nowhere. Again, I could give you so many examples and cite so many debates I've seen on this subject, but when it comes down to it, it's never really changed. There was a movement a few years ago called the National Popular Vote. It was something that I found very complex, but states would agree to give their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote nationally. Democrats supported it. Democratic legislators opted for changing the Constitution. Republicans wouldn't touch it. I would suspect we'll see some criticism of this, but in the end, the Republicans will support staying with the Electoral College and the system we've had for quite a long time. And one more thing on this. There are now 33 states in which Republicans control the governorship and both houses of the legislature. I would not want to be a citizen trying to start the genesis of a movement to go to popular election of president with those numbers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the numbers just don't work for the other side in trying to get this done at all. Let me ask you then too, going back to the election, looking at the Senate and the House races, so the Republicans, who were early on, months and months ago, were they were going to lose control of the Senate and probably lose 6 seats or whatever. They hung on. It looks like it's a 51-49. Is that the official count?
52-48.
52-48. Okay, that's the official. And we lost Senator Ayotte, and Joe Heck wasn't able to take Harry Reid's seat. But that was surprising because Ron Johnson was given up for dead by the Republicans months ago, it seemed, and he came back and beat Feingold. What does this mean? And the House didn't. There's very little turnover in the House.
Net loss of 4.
Right. So what does this mean for the Republican agenda and then working with President Trump? I don't think anybody really predicted that we'd get a Republican president and keep the Senate. At the House, I think, was never in doubt. But keeping the Senate and getting a Republican president, what do you see going on forward with legislation and things like that the Republicans have been stewing about for the last 8 years?
On the first week that the new president takes office, there will be the move to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's Obamacare. It will be done through the budget reconciliation mechanism, which means it needs 51 votes. Then in the House, it will pass resoundingly. The president will sign it. And a new health care system that allows people to purchase health care across state lines, the way one does car insurance, will be put in. It will also most likely include dependents staying on their parents' insurance until they're 26, and allowing people to, in another case, if ban discrimination by insurance companies if someone has a pre-existing condition. Now, what's interesting is both those proposals are contained in the Affordable Care Act. They were originally offered by Republican legislators when the health care debate began in 2009. But Republicans wanted them introduced as separate pieces of legislation. Democrats were bound and determined to overturn the current health system at the time and put in what we're dealing with now. In other words, some of those problems could have been solved without having to throw out a system that 92% of Americans were satisfied with, those who had health insurance. And this would have allowed people to expand and get more health insurance that way. And I think the numbers would have been cut down with it. Now they're going to try to go back to what there was with the improvements on it that were offered at the time, and also create the market atmosphere that allowed so many of the plans that were canceled in the early part of the last decade to come back. For example, in the state of Georgia, 1 million people had their health insurance plans canceled. And there was particular resentment because many times, including in my presence once, Barack Obama said, if you like the health insurance policy you have, you can keep it, period.
Right. All right. One last thing before we have to wrap this. Oh, you want to say something?
One other thing. The president, in his first few days, will likely name a Supreme Court appointee to replace the late Antonin Scalia. My money is on Judge Bill Pryor of Alabama, former state attorney general. And if that happens, the Republicans will confirm him in the Senate. If the Democrats try to filibuster, and they're still permitted to filibuster Supreme Court appointments, reliable sources tell me they will simply use the nuclear option the way Harry Reid did on federal judges and eliminate the filibuster for a Supreme Court appointment and move ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I meant to ask you about the Supreme Court because that's obviously very, very important. I want to just one quick comment from you. Still betting on Sean Spicer for press secretary?
Yes.
Okay. When is he going to name that press secretary, do you think?
Any day now.
Any day now? All right, so we're kind of waiting with bated breath on that. John, I want to thank you for joining us today. This was great. Your political mind, all the things that you know are just unparalleled, in my opinion. And I know you knew my father and everything like that, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come in and see me today. For those of you out there that haven't read Gizzi on Politics, you have to. It's a must-read. John covers all the issues and with great detail. Especially that, I love that column you did on Robert Vaughn and the Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Yes.
As a child of that era, I loved it.
The preceding was a paid political announcement.
That's right. And thank you once again for joining us for the Bias Buzz. And join me tomorrow when I have Cliff Kincaid coming in. So we'll see you then. Thanks a lot.